you're here for the trails. I'm Breeden, projects coordinator and resident nature connection. Dom said nerd, but I prefer nutcase at Trash Free Trails. Yeah, so I'd like to start actually, I think it was David asked about why trash. And actually it was back to one of the first conversations me and Dom had, and it was about, like, trash is an all-encompassing word. It's not just about what you find on the floor, it's about what you find in your head, what you find in your heart, what you find in the hearts and heads of other people. So actually, we call it mental trash, and I'm looking for something else, but you know, unnecessary aggression, inappropriate communication, discrimination, that's also trash. Oh, come on. That we don't want on our trails. So I'd like to just bring that into things as well. And the other reason I'm here is because I found mountain biking, it was an incredibly difficult time in my life, and it saved me. The other part is why. That why is the part of mountain biking that I am and always will be the most interested in. Whether it's the thrill of the speedy descent, being out in nature, lone rocks, drops, or the weirdos you find yourself out there with, whatever it might be yet to be there that gets you out into the hills is subjective, and arguably fairly obvious to those looking in. For me it's mountain biking, for you it might be something else, but how your favourite nature activity makes you feel, and the reasons for feeling that way, are something more, and something we all share together. At the same time though, those things are incredibly personal, and therefore to me, incredibly interesting. It's what drove me to undertake a psychology of mental health masters at the University of Edinburgh. And yeah, right, it must have been something pretty weird to make you go and do something like that out of education for 5 years with no experience of psychology or mental health. In a word, it's connection. Now to what? That's why we're here. Over the next few minutes, I hope I can begin to explain some of that. So we all know that single-use pollution has a negative effect. So why does it still happen? And that goes back to what I was saying about trash. Something I feel I was able to contribute to Trash Free Trails from that first conversation was a why. Why does it end up there? Why is single-use pollution in those places that we care about the most? And the question's already been asked, like what kind of demographics, and do we have any idea about why it's there? It's something I say a lot, but after all, if we don't go some of the way to figuring that out, then all we're doing is removing, reporting and rewarding, and we'll be back to square one before we know it. It's in our values, and of course it's a combination of hugely complicated, interconnected systems to which there isn't a simple answer. We've got to start somewhere, right? It's a tired cliche these days, but the world isn't what it used to be. Common mental disorders such as anxiety, depression, bipolar and PTSD are experienced at higher rates than ever before. At the same time, the world, our world, is being exploited, neglected and destroyed in ways that could never have been imagined not all that long ago. Now, I don't think that's a coincidence. Several authors have explored this relationship, and whilst there might be a number of factors at play, the fact that ecological grief is an established term in mental health literature speaks untold volumes. Despite this, we continue to act as if the world is of no use to us, in ways that are not only of proven detriment to the environment, but also our own collective well-being. Again though, why? Amongst other researchers, Stephen Mayer and Cynthia France, authors of the Connectedness to Nature Scale, have been able to demonstrate that the more connected to nature people are, the more they care about the environment, and the more they do to protect it. Similarly, those who are less connected to nature care less about the environment. But that's pretty obvious, right? And I'll actually connect that to something that Becky said about the bigger the group size, the more connected to nature people are. And that's really interesting because it's not just connection to nature, it's connection to people and self that helps us care about the places that we care about the most. So this is how Mayer and France defined connection to nature. A feeling of kinship and an effective individual experience of connection with nature. Now, that's important that it says with and not to, because we're part of nature. So this definition was as part of their seminal paper, which established the Connectedness to Nature scale, which is probably the most widely used scale when authors are looking at examining this construct. However, it was first considered in writing by Wilson in 1984 with the biophilia hypothesis. This is a great phrase. The biophilia hypothesis states that humans are genetically predisposed to seek out nature and nature-based experiences. But since then, psychologists have identified different components of nature connection so that we might be better able to understand it and get the most out of nature and the connective abilities it has. So Wesley Schultz in 2000 was amongst the first to consider the concept scientifically with the inclusion to nature in self scale. And again, that's a different term, isn't it? How much do you see nature in you rather than you in nature? So there's already two levels to it. He also proposed the extent to which an individual care to the environment is directly related to how connected to it they consider themselves. So what's coming out of this is the concept of nature connection is born out of care for the environment. So you can see that's how this is starting to build up, how they're all connected to each other. See, connected. Since then, various research have developed it again, and a number of different measures used to assess the construct, to assess the extent to which individuals and groups are connected to nature. So research might better understand that relationship. Here's just a few examples. I don't know if you can see, this is the wrong slide. I don't know if, so, as you can see from some of the titles of these papers, so connectivity with nature, inclusion with nature itself, the nature relatedness scale, the relationship of childhood upbringing and university degree programs and environmental identity. You know, environmental identity, inclusion of nature itself, connectivity with nature, nature relatedness. They all appear different, but I think they're really the same thing. In that seminal paper in 2004, Mayer and France developed Schultz's three components: cognitive, affective, physical or behavioural. So cognitive is the core of nature connection, how we feel, how we view our place in the natural world. Affective is more emotional, our sense of care for nature, the emotional reaction we have towards it. Behavioural is what we do, if anything, to care for it. The fact that the different measures we considered on the previous slide address these three components quite specifically adds strength to the approach that we have these three spectrums of nature connection. Some authors might argue the case that emotional affinity towards nature is not the same construct as nature connection, for example, as in the way you feel towards it might not be the same as how connected you are with it, but there's been enough meta-analyses now from people like Tam and Capaldi that have confirmed these measures to be different interpretations of the same construct, and then they define it again slightly differently, the individual's subjective sense of connection with nature. As a result, most people often use the term nature connectedness or nature connection to incorporate everything that I've just talked about. So back into the more extreme sports side of things, Eric Breimer is a prominent researcher in an extreme sports field, especially with the connection to nature, well-being and extreme sports. With papers such as exploring perceptions of how nature recreation benefits mental well-being and health and well-being in an outdoor and adventure sports context, his work is a bit of me, and I'm pretty sure it's a bit of all of you here. For anyone with a penchant for journal articles that go into incredible detail on extreme sports and how beneficial it can be for people, I strongly urge you to check out his work. So in collaboration with other researchers, he consistently finds that those who display higher levels of great nature connection display lower levels of anxiety. And these are long-term studies, short-term studies. It's a consistent finding. Furthermore, in interventions such as mountain biking, for example, and he has done a mountain biking paper, I just couldn't find it for the purpose of this slide. I'm not very good with this clicker, am I? Participants experience significant improvement in all of those indicators of psychological well-being we've come to know and love, anxiety and depression. Experimental evidence clearly demonstrates that connection to nature is good for us and good for nature, but some people have taken this a step further, arguing that connection to nature is the oldest and most necessary form of connection. Remember the biophilia hypothesis? It's in our genes, yet we continue to exploit it. And actually it's been developed further by Kaplan in 1995, who developed attention restoration theory. This kind of is what it says on the tin, but the concept is that the stresses of the modern world of daily life can be restored by time in nature away from those struggles of daily life. And again, this has been measured long-term, short-term, and it's a consistent finding, it's pretty robust. So again, I ask you, why, if so many people agree that nature is good for us, that we need it, do we continue to treat it with such disrespect? Earlier on, I mentioned that the world is experiencing never-before rises in common mental health disorders, and previously unheard of damage and lack of care for the environment. Could it be the reason that for all of this is that we're becoming less and less connected to that which we rely on the most? So, an increased reliance on technology, coupled with the rise of urbanisation, is often attributed to this exponential rise in disconnection that we keep talking about. People interact with nature far less than they used to as a result. And it's hard to argue with this, to be fair. TVs are becoming more and more like real life. VR, AR, PS5, the new Xbox, whatever it's called now, Surface Pro, iPhone 12 Plus, Galaxy Pro S21, whatever it is. The pull of the screen is fierce, but there it is again. Why do we prefer a screen to reality these days? It's actually kind of simple. What happens is they replicate what we get from the real world. They replicate the pathways based on nature connection that Miles Richardson came up with: senses, emotion, beauty, meaning, and compassion. But the screen it just hijacks them. It just uses sight and sound. There's nothing else. There's no taste, there's no touch, there's no feel. We seek connection in all of its forms, and essentially technology has given us a fast-track way of connecting to whatever it is that's behind the screen, or at the flick of the thumb on a turbo scroll. The prevalence of nature connection is such that Richard Louv postulated nature deficit disorder. It's kind of hotly disputed, but I'd argue that it's true. We all experience it. Whilst not all authors agree with that, proponents of the theory cite a lack of contact with nature being a causal, and that's important, causal in the occurrence of health and behaviour-related problems, particularly children. Our friend Eric Brymer, I mentioned a couple of slides ago, has contributed to these findings, stating that disconnection from nature can result in these problems worsening or becoming more frequent. Other studies have agreed, and the sentiment around the human-nature relationship is increasingly leaning towards the importance of addressing the endemic issue of a lack of nature connection in an effort to improve well-being. So how many people in this room, know it if you're not able to get out? And I mean know it inside you. If you're not able to get out in nature for whatever reason, I'm sure that you all experience this. A show of hands, how many people feel that? See, that's no surprise. So we're all sold on that notion that nature connection is good for us. If you're not, we're going to go outside. And to be fair, I'm kind of preaching to the choir a little bit here, right? We're all outdoors people. I'd be surprised if I saw anybody dropping litter and not picking it up. So let's go for a minute. Let's go for a minute to a place where people don't get it. Imagine for a second never going to a local park. Imagine for a second growing up in a situation where you don't have the privileges that we've all grown up with. The money, the support network, whatever it might be. Without that kind of support network that promotes nature for play, exercise, and existence. And these are the kind of people that Joe works with. At the PRU unit near Leeds. Some of the young people she has the pleasure of teaching have never been to a park, never climbed a tree, never got their hands in the dirt, and never heard that sound of a bike wheel ripping up the gravel. People like us find that hard to imagine, right? But it's more and more of an issue with every day that passes. A few years ago, The Guardian put out some shocking numbers. 60%. Whilst nature-based education has been around for some time, these figures are not promising. It's not being taken up in the way it should be, and it's not received as well as you might think by the young people that are on the receiving end of it. It's worrying for all the reasons I mentioned, but now, more than ever, we need to connect with our children. We need to connect our children to the natural world around them. So that's where we come in. That's where the Selfharm Academy comes in. It's a youth engagement project that offers the young people the opportunity to learn mountain biking skills whilst developing their nature connection and attitudes to litter and the environment in an effort to improve their self-esteem, confidence, and overall well-being. You might have heard all about it, and if you've had anything to do with me, you definitely would have heard something about it. But we just finished the second pilot of the programme, and I'm going to tell you some stories, because, as Tom said, we all know the importance of stories. At the beginning of the first pilot with Joe's PRU lads, Maheen, Billy and Logan weren't the best of mates. Mo was often the subject of racial abuse, and the three were, let's just say, a handful. What's fast becoming our favourite quote from the Selfharm Academy programme is, "I'm not picking up any effing litter." It was thrown out several times. Now, I'm not going to stand here and pretend to you that these young lads are now model citizens. They've come from extraordinarily difficult backgrounds. They can't afford food, let alone a 10 grand e-bike. And therefore have extremely complex social and emotional needs that a 6-week programme is only going to scratch the surface of at best. The development of people such as this requires constant, holistic and substantial intervention at every level. However, through the course of the programme, friendships developed where there was previously racial abuse. They were helping each other out on the trail, teaching each other skills that they had learned and sharing their trash hauls amongst each other. The absolute star of the show, Mo, has even gone on to organise his own trail collections in his local community, totally off his own back. Bear in mind that before the programme, these young lads were violent, aggressive, and you'd be lucky if they thought for 1 second about where their drinks can end up. Now, they can't wait to recycle, and that's a quote. The second pilot was a little more challenging for a number of reasons. The young people involved don't work with Joe on a daily basis, and she had to forge that connection with them. she was still able to do that. However, the gauntlet, I'm not picking up any litter, was once again thrown down and the challenge accepted. In week 4, they were asked to design some posters. And here's what they came up with. And these are, so they were given a stencil, but apart from that, like they were given, this is totally off their own bat. I don't know if I'll pass them around. That's the best one, by the way. You've got things like all of our slogans on there: leave a positive trace, jumps not dumps. It's respect the trail, and I think another quote that Joe's mentioned now is, "Will you respect the trail, innit, miss?" And that's just something that they don't do. They don't do that. And we talked about stewardship before. We talked about ownership, and when people feel like something is theirs, there's no way they're going to damage it. And Dom talks a lot about the self-harm analogy. Like, there's people like you and me. It's kind of akin to self-harm if we drop something on our trail, because that's part of us. We grew up with it, and it developed us as human beings. So to see that change in someone who was so diametrically opposite, even in over 6 weeks, and again, like, it's difficult to keep it going because of the backgrounds that these people come from. But in a 6-week program, we were able to do all that. Imagine what we could do with like substantial educational system change. So, I had the pleasure of attending both of the pilots at the graduations, and I can tell you something. These young people are yearning for that very same sense of belonging. Remember, I summarised why we're all here, and we're all here for the trails. We're here because we belong. We belong to that, the trails belong to us. But these kids don't have that. They don't have that sense of belonging. That's what we're trying to give them. We don't have the time to detail now why people end up the way we are. But in these young people, their search for identity has been rocky. They're constantly fighting for attention because they are searching for purpose. They need direction, drive to fight for something that's bigger than themselves. When I arrived in my Trash Free Trails jersey, I felt like a celebrity. They all wanted to know who I was and what I was doing there. And when I told them, genuinely had stars in their eyes. It was a funny feeling and not something I expected or prepared myself for. But consider this. This is the first time in these young people's lives where they felt like it's not just them. The first time they've felt a sense of collective responsibility and ownership, giving them the space to develop that identity they seek so passionately. I presented them with their certificates, and they co-branded Sprayway and Trash Free Trails jackets, and they instantly became a part of the trash hall, part of the lifeblood of the organisation, and I'm there thanking them for that. How would you see me in that scenario? I'm not going to pretend I know where you've all come from, but these young lads are in a minority. Now, just bear with me for a second. I'd like everyone to close their eyes for a minute and just put yourself in the shoes of a 12-year-old lad who has never experienced nature. You're going to find it difficult. Now picture yourself riding bikes in the woods with your mates, caring about that place, wearing a Trash Free Trails and Sprayway uniform. How do you feel? I've got one more video for you. You can open your eyes. The mouse has stopped working now. Okay, I don't need the last video. But it was another, oh, come on. Oh, we were doing so well. What's happened?
Was the internet favourite?
Oh, the internet one, right, okay, what here? No? This one? Oh, fine. I firmly believe that the reason why single-use pollution ends up in our trails and in our wild places and on our trails is down to disconnection, to people and to places and to self. And we're going to do something about that in a second. But as I said, and as we all know, it's way bigger than that. As a society, we are disconnected from each other, and we are disconnected from that natural world. I'd argue it's as simple as this. If we weren't disconnected, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't treat the world in the way we do. I ask you to keep your eyes closed. So if I can ask you to bring yourself back into that situation of a young lad who's never experienced nature and never been out on a bike, we're going to do a workshop, and Joe's going to tell you more about what we're going to do.